The Phileas Club is entirely financed by Patreon at patreon.com/the Phileas Club. The link is in the show notes. And of course, that's the only way to support the show. We don't have sponsors, we don't have third parties, and we stay entirely independent thanks to the audience, to the listeners that decide the show is worth something and go to the site and support it with real money. So thanks a million, as always, to those of you who choose to do that. And on with the show. Hey everyone, and welcome to the Phileas Club. This is episode 122. It's a follow-up on an episode we did back in 2017 about the situation in Venezuela. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Phileas Club. In this show, what we do is that we get people from different parts of the world to discuss the news from around the world, and so the idea is that you will get opinions and angles from people with different cultures and backgrounds, and that's what we usually do. But as you know, we try to do a special episode almost every month, and on those episodes we cover one specific topic and we talk to one specific person, hopefully having them help us understand what's happening in a region of the world or about a certain ideology and things like that. Today we're going to be talking, it's kind of a follow-up to an episode we did about a year and a half ago about Venezuela. It was episode number 94, and we spoke at that point with Saúl González, who is kind enough to be coming back on the show. So the first thing to do is probably to introduce and thank Saúl for being on the show again. Hey, how are you doing, Saúl?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me over again, Patrick.
I'm very glad that you agreed to be back on the show, because the situation in Venezuela seems to be changing quite a bit, and you helped me, and I hope the audience understand it last time. And I can't believe it's been a year and a half, almost. I guess a year out of that was me reeling from the birth of our first child, which means it disappeared into a black hole of timelessness. So it's really only been 4 months. I guess that makes more sense in my time scale. But jokes aside, it was a really interesting episode, and I would encourage the audience to go listen to it if they haven't already. It was episode 94, once again. But I will ask you to summarize a little bit of what's been happening up until now in the country, because first of all, honestly, I don't really understand most of it. I'll tell you what I've heard, and I know that the situation is very difficult, but it would be helpful for you to summarize all of this. But before we do that, I'm curious how you're doing, and if you can maybe introduce yourself to the audience, where you are, what's your relationship to Venezuela, and all of that.
Okay. Yes, so I am Venezuelan, born and raised in Venezuela. I spent most of my life there, live abroad for about 6 years doing graduate studies, but I went back to Venezuela in 2012. Which was around the time Maduro got to power, and the country situation went from bad to worse, and we started to have mass migration or even a refugee crisis around 2016-17, and that was around the time I myself had to leave the country with my wife. So me and my wife have been living in Colombia for the past year and a half.
And how has that been going? Have you managed, I guess, two questions. First, are there many people who have been forced to do that? And second, how are you getting on? Because it's been now a year and a half. Are you managing to, have you found a job? Like, you're essentially a refugee, kind of, I guess. How is the situation going?
Yeah, well, the situation is very complicated, and lots of people have had to leave Venezuela. This is probably like the second biggest refugee crisis in the world, or second only to Syria. Over 10% of the population of Venezuela, that's over 3 million people, have left Venezuela in the past 5 years. if you go to most countries in Latin America, you will find a lot of Venezuelans there now. And as with any refugee crisis, well, there's all kinds of stories. There are some people who managed to migrate in a relatively ordered way. Others who, just had to flee the country on foot, with no possessions at all, in a state of destitute poverty.
Mm.
So that's it's all over the place, but especially in Colombia, which is where I'm right now. It's right next to Venezuela. It's the first stop for lots of people. So Colombia is the one that's is the one country that's feeling most the impacts of the refugee crisis.
Mm.
For over 1 million Venezuelans are now in Colombia, and many of them are exactly that, refugees, which need a lot of support and help from the state or from the public, because they're in a very bad situation. They're diseased, they don't have enough to eat, etc., etc.
Mm. Okay, so I guess we'll get back to that at some point. But for now, for a quick refresher for the people who haven't followed the original episode or who don't really know what the situation is, yeah, I guess can you can you tell us about the situation up until, I guess, the current crisis, which is Juan Guaido versus Nicolas Maduro?
Okay, yes. So I wanted to give a quick recap to how we got here, because some of it is relevant. So maybe like no more than 2-3 minutes.
It's okay, we have time.
Okay, great. So recap: in Venezuela at the turn of the century, 1999, Hugo Chavez becomes president. He's a political outsider. He is has a military background. Led a coup d'état attempt against the government in 1992. But the government became unpopular. So on the other hand, Chavez as a figure became popular, and he capitalized on that, ran for president and won, and became president in 1999. And in the first years, he was very popular, and he used that popularity to basically take over the Venezuelan state, not only the executive power, but also like fill Congress with supporters, fill the Supreme Court with supporters, also the electoral board, the main oil company. He used that popularity to really, like I mentioned, control pretty much every part of the Venezuelan state.
I'll interrupt you here for a second because I want to ask you specific questions.
Yes.
We have, especially in France, but I think across the world, some people who defend that political party, and Maduro today being the kind of heir
Yes.
of the party, and who kind of dismiss claims of dictatorship, or maybe that's a little bit extreme, but at least a regime that is not entirely democratic. What would you say to those people? Because we have a lot of people who don't know about the actual Venezuelan situation, and who hold up the example of Chavez as, the people winning over the ruling elites, and kind of an ideal, almost not communist, but at least socialist / democratic movement. Is that a fair way to represent it, at least at the beginning, or do you not see it like that at all?
Okay, I think at the beginning that was the promise. As I mentioned, he won the first election fair and square. He was very popular, and indeed, I mean, what he did at the beginning was, politically smart, but at the very beginning legal, which is okay. I'm a very popular politician, so I'm going to run elections and I'm going to fill my candidates. And since I'm popular, my candidates win. And at the beginning, he that was his state purpose, which is we need to, the state is corrupt, the elites are ruling. Whether you agree with that or not, that was his message. And he says he was going to improve things and basically destroy corruption. So he brought what he called a revolution, And his policies were, as you mentioned, socialist, which is the state takes control of a lot of things, and he's a big spender. I mean, social spending increased a lot, which was a very popular policy. But also Chavez was very lucky in a sense that just as he gained power, oil prices rose incredibly. I mean, we saw a raise like over 5 times that was previously oil prices. So people in Venezuela could see a change from the previous government to his government. He was very big on empowering people. He was very big on social spending, and indeed, poor people in Venezuela saw an increase on the quality of life, and that was most evident to people from the outside of Venezuela. So I could understand that people who are only seeing that having this view of Chavez, but on the inside, this is not the only way to look at it, because as he was doing that, as I mentioned, he was also increasing his political power, basically trying to dismantle checks and balances. And also, his policies were good in the short term, but as we will see, they were not really sustainable. So, so this was again like good in the short term and good if oil prices are through the roof, but not sustainable for more than 5 or 10 years.
All right. So please keep going. You were saying that you were at Chavez gaining power.
Yes. So I mentioned Chavez gains power and slowly, like bit by bit, takes over the state. And around 2002, like 3 or 4 years after he gains power, he starts to become more of a divisive figure because he starts to become more authoritarian, more open about not wanting there to be any opposition, more open about having a view that either you're with us, you're with the revolution, or you are against us, and you're part of the extreme right, or you're part of the U.S. and CIA-backed combatants that want to destabilize this wonderful revolution. So he starts to really polarize the country in a way. And again, he goes from becoming very popular to having a country that's maybe half with him, but half against him. And something important about taking over the state is that he now has control of the electoral board. So from now on, all electoral events become lopsided. He starts to putting his hand on the scale using the controls he has as the state to make it harder for opposition politicians to win any kind of election and easier for his supporters to win an election. So at this moment, it's not impossible for an opposition politician to run in an election, but it starts to become more and more uphill.
So we're in the middle of the 2000s, I guess,
Yes.
and we're kind of in a maybe dictatorial, but definitely not democratic situation anymore.
Yes, exactly. That's the case. And in the terms of economic policy, what you mentioned as socialism, so he starts to nationalize everything, pretty much every sector of the economy. I don't know if this is a word in English, he expropriates. He uses the power of the state to say, okay, this is a private company, but now it's public. So he starts to control every aspect of the economy. He sets price controls. He sets currency exchange controls. And this is all incredibly inefficient. And the only way this doesn't collapse immediately is because of very high income from oil. And also the Chavez government starts borrowing incredibly. And basically Venezuela was the only oil producing nation that was also borrowing, because all other oil producing nations, they were raking in money from oil profits. But Venezuela was the only one that felt a need to borrow that much, even with we're already making that much money from oil. So again, the economy becomes a completely state-controlled economy, and the only thing that's sustaining the economy is oil money that has to go through Chavez. So this is also a way for Chavez to be, the pillar of the economy, and all the economy depends on him.
When you say the oil money that has to go to Chavez, you mean that it all goes through the government and the government then redistributes it? Or is it more personal?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I mean going through the government in
Mm.
Venezuela. And this is from many years ago, over 50 years ago, the states holds the monopoly on oil exploitation. So yes, like oil exports go exclusively through the state, and yes, then the states redistribute this. Due
Mm.
to corruption, then a lot of this money also goes to Chavez and Chavez officials. But at the moment, there's enough money to go back to private pockets, and also basically fund the whole nation.
Mm. I see. So when are we at this point?
Like essentially, basically the 2000s, the first decade of the century, and this was like the situation until 2013,
Okay.
which is when because Chavez died, then Maduro runs for office as Chavez's successor.
Mm.
And something important to mention here is that it was a very close election. It was contested because, like I mentioned before, for several years now, the state has his finger on the scale. So the election was contested. The opposition candidate that ran at the time did not recognize the results, said that there was fraud, and again, like about half the people in Venezuela also believed that vote for him believed that there was fraud, but ultimately he was not, the opposition candidate was not able to further his claim. It was not recognized internationally, so ultimately the one that became ultimately recognized was Maduro in 2013.
Okay. So that was 2013. We're getting closer to the moment when we recorded the episode. At that point, things were still, I wouldn't say stable, but they were kind of working. Were oil prices supporting the country still?
Okay, yes, up to that point, just like Chavez was unlucky, Maduro was, in a sense, you will say unlucky, because that was the time that oil prices, quote unquote, collapsed.
Mm.
And I say collapsed because, probably we had oil price went to about about half what they were. We were like in the hundreds,
Mm.
$100 a barrel to $50 a barrel. So it was a huge blow to the Maduro regime. But still, this is much historically much higher to oil prices in the 80s and the 90s, and most other oil producing countries had prepared for this scenario, but Venezuela hadn't. And basically two things happened. So oil prices went down, where for this whole socialist economic policy to be sustainable, they needed price to go even higher, but that
Mm.
didn't happen. And also, like all the debt that Chavez borrowed a decade ago started to become due.
Mm.
So the government was in a double bind, which is they have no income from oil, and they also have to pay debt. But instead of changing the economic policies, they basically started to double down on them and try to institute even more price controls, trying to make the country even more dependent on imports. By now, all these industries that Chavez had nationalized, they became basically non-functional because they were staffed with cronies. They were staffed with people who for which the main criteria for selection was loyalty to the revolution, loyalty to Chavez, and not competence.
Mm.
So basically, Venezuela became a country where nothing was ever produced internally. So yes, the whole economy was depending on oil. So when oil price went down and we had terrible economic policies, this started to really impact the economy and the livelihood of the people. So
Okay.
we're starting to see a collapse in salaries. We start to see a lack of medicine. We start to see a lack of food in general. So things start, we go from a country that, it has its own problems and maybe has like a polarizing government that some people say is starting to be authoritarian, to a country where now a humanitarian crisis is brewing and people are starting to have a really hard time making ends meet.
And that's when Maduro was already in power, correct?
Yes, exactly. This is when Maduro is in power, and in 2014, as a result of this, we start to see like mass demonstrations, popular protests against the government, and this also when Maduro responds with an iron fist. So again, before like Chavez, I said like was authoritarian, but Maduro really like took it to another level, and he started to mass arrest people. He started to have opening fire into protesters. So in 2014, we have popular protests for about 3 months, and over 100 people were killed by Maduro forces, or hundreds of people were imprisoned. So this is also the point where people start unambiguously calling Maduro a dictator.
Okay, and is that when the incredible inflation starts?
Yes, we start to see pretty big inflation, but and of course this is devastating to people's salary. But it's only the prelude. I think like we start seeing hyperinflation is a few years later, like in 2017 or anything, basically around the time we did the previous episode. So at the moment inflation is bad, pretty bad, but not hyperinflation yet.
Okay. All right. So in a few words, what happens between 2013 and 2017 when we last spoke?
Okay, so after that, the next important milestone is 2015, because in 2015, a new Congress is elected. And at this point, maybe because of miscalculation by Maduro, he thought he retained more popularity than he did. Uh, the opposition to Maduro, the democratic forces, are able to basically win a supermajority in Congress, and this was a big upset. But what Maduro does is that he immediately begins to undermine this Congress. He basically refused to recognize the authority of Congress. He says that he has the court declared that a few of the elections were rigged, were stolen by the opposition politicians with no proof whatsoever. So based on this, he refused to recognize them and refused to recognize the whole of Congress. So he uses the lame duck session to stack the Supreme Court with even more loyalists than before, and basically starts to override Congress by force. So this point is again like the start of what we call a constitutional crisis in Venezuela, in the sense that now Maduro is not only like ruling with an iron fist and punishing demonstrations heavily, but also he is like openly contradicting the Venezuelan constitution. And especially like, for example, the Venezuelan constitution is very clear about things like if the government wants to issue new debt, they have to go through Congress, and he's going to just ignore that and issue new debt, without paying any attention to Congress, and basically like not openly just yet, but basically trying to dissolve Congress or strip Congress of its powers because he doesn't control it anymore.
It's really incredible that when you describe it, and I remember thinking this last time, that we still have people, some people supporting that government. Is there, first of all, how do you look at this? And second, is there an argument to be made that this is the people fighting against the empire of the Americans that try to control everything? Or because there's a lot of that in the I don't know, it's kind of mind-blowing that speaking, the description, which seems quite verifiable, it's not like this is subject to a lot of interpretation, that people come to the conclusion that, oh, he's a nice guy and he's just misunderstood, kind of.
Okay, yes, I think there are two reasons for this, and to be honest, I mean, I know what you're talking about, and as a Venezuelan, this is very frustrating
Mm,
to see people on the international stage defend the regime, and I think it's due to two reasons. I mean, in part, I think a lot of people have egalitarian ideals, or a lot of people, they have left wing politics, and from afar at the beginning, the Chavez project seemed like an awesome project. Like, oh, there's this great guy who is using socialism to bring forward their country, and especially, if you are the kind of person who, for example, doesn't like the U.S. very much, so the fact that Chavez is like opposing the U.S. and trying to build like a multipolar world, these are these are all great ideas on paper to you, but so when confronted with the reality that this was pretty much all a facade, and in the end Chavez is just one more dictator. Some people have a hard time understanding that.
mm,
I mean, honestly, I mean, I mean, it's so shocking, or it's so in conflict with their internal values that they want to look the other way, or they don't want to believe it. That's like the naive interpretation. Of course, there are also some that the ones that just want to deny the truth,
mm,
and they want to promote socialism at all costs, or they think like all left wing governments are good, all right wing governments are bad. They want to either believe or promote that idea, so they just gloss over the facts and
mm.
try to promote the idea that the Maduro government is good.
You know,
So that's yes.
it's really frustrating to me because from 90% of the world, I am a socialist, and
Mm,
socialist not in the communist sense. I
mm,
live in France. I'm very happy with 90% of the situation in France. I believe in unemployment benefits, in free education, in healthcare. I believe in all of those things. And to me, this is modern socialism, or maybe you want
mm,
to call it social democracy, but even the
mm,
some of the people would disagree with that. Um, and I consider myself to be on the left wing of the stage of the world. And I think
mm,
a lot of people in France would not look at it like that because they only see France. But
mm.
even with this, looking at that situation, I don't see how you could consider that, oh, it's defending the leftist ideals. But anyway, okay, let's not spend too much time on that.
No, but this touches on something that's important to me as well, and I see your point, and I come to it, I guess, from the opposite side, which is, to me, socialism, and for most of Latin America, socialism is the project of Hugo Chavez. He named it 21st century socialism.
mm,
And it was a project not only in Venezuela, but he engaged in a lot of interventionism. And since he had lots of money, he funded pretty like left wing candidates all over Latin America during the 2000s. So he had lots of allies in the region. And again, like 21st century socialism was a continental project, but in most of these other countries, they tried to replicate what Chavez did, but thankfully they were not successful. I mean, they had most of them that had terrible policies, but they did not manage to take over the state.
mm,
So again, like most people were able to push him out, push those governments out, and now we have a way of quote unquote right wing governments in Latin America. But again, most of these countries in Latin America they're considered right wing, but probably in other parts of the world they're just centrist or even center left, because Latin America is a region that has like pretty progressive politics policies in general. So even most of these right wing governments, they have a lot of social spending. They try to promote like access to quality healthcare for everyone, etc., etc. So one thing I want to say is that labels like right wing and left wing a lot of times are misleading.
mm,
And also talking about the word socialism, I believe, I mean, again, in Latin America, if you say socialism, people are going to think about Chavez. There's no way around that.
Right.
So a word that basically encompasses both Chavez and France and Norway and Cuba. I think it's kind of useless. I think we
Right.
need to find new words. So, for example, I prefer words like progressive,
Mm.
or I prefer words to like the welfare state. If we're talking, for example, of Norway, I think these are much better words to refer to ideologies. If someone
Right.
says socialism, I'm going to be, skeptical to begin with, either fairly or unfairly.
Okay, fair enough. A quick question. When you're talking about those governments that are, right wing, but really, if you can, it doesn't fit the image that some people have of right wing. I'm guessing you're not talking about Bolsonaro in Brazil. We recently did an episode on Brazil, and things seem to be. I mean, he's a character closer to Donald Trump. I'm guessing that's not part of your, maybe it's a reaction to what happened. I don't know what I'm talking about, but what do you think of that situation? In 2 words, we don't want to spend too much time on that.
No, yeah. Bolsonaro is extreme right wing, even by Latin American standards. So when I mentioned this government, I think the Colombian government, which has been consistently been right wing, or even the recent government of Macri in Argentina, I think are better examples. So, for example, to say Colombia is again quote unquote right wing, but he has pretty progressive policies.
Okay.
Really, progressive taxation, lots of social spending. So I think it's a good template
Okay.
to think about what a quote unquote right wing government looks like in Latin America.
Okay. All right. So the situation in 2017, roughly, hyperinflation, mass emigration, and what we talked about on that show. You personally leave the country. You have to flee the country, actually. Maybe you want to give us a little bit more detail on the context there, and then we can talk about what's happened since.
Yes. So basically, what happened in 2017 is very relevant because we have another round of mass protests, and this was triggered by the fact that Maduro decided to, you just like completely take off his mask, and having Congress around was, like too much
A hassle?
of a nuisance.
Hmm.
Yeah, a hassle. So he didn't dissolve it, but he had the Supreme Court issue a ruling that says that Congress is null, and from now on, the Supreme Court will take over all the duties of Congress. And this was a play to try to give himself a veneer of legality, especially when it came to needing to issue new debt to fund the regime.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you again.
Yes.
He basically said, well, Congress doesn't matter. Goodbye, thank you.
Basically, he said that.
How can anyone look at the situation in that country and say they are the democracy that stands against the tyranny of capitalism? How is it?
Well,
Anyway, sorry, I don't get it. Keep going.
okay, well, that's important. Also, something I wanted to mention before, but I forgot, is that the Venezuelan government, or the Venezuelan regime, or the Maduro regime, is very, very good at information warfare. And something that's also important, he has his advisors, or, well, we'll go into that later, but he is constantly advised by the Cuban government, which is also pretty good at this, and also has close ties to the Russian government. So the Maduro regime is very good at trying to manipulate public opinion internationally, and send out fake information or send out confusion information to basically create exactly what you're saying, like trying to play this up as the people are fighting against U.S. imperialism, and everyone that opposes Maduro is again like a U.S. supporter or a Trump supporter or backed by the CIA, or even playing up like racial tensions, like saying, oh, because Venezuela in the past was ruled by all white people, and all the brown poor people were oppressed. But since now the Chavez government has given them a voice, the white people are pushing back, and this, in the context of Venezuela, is completely ridiculous. I mean, you could make the case that this could be a plausible description of maybe some other countries, but in Venezuela, everyone is pretty much mixed race. So he makes, the Maduro regime puts out these bouts of propaganda that are very well designed to resonate with people outside of Venezuela, but that, are as you mentioned, if people go to the trouble of verifying, then they can see this is all a facade, this is all a lie. But the truth is, most people in other countries don't go to the trouble of verifying. Venezuela is some far off country that they don't know much about, so these kinds of propaganda turn out to be effective.
Yeah, I can understand for regular citizens, regular people, but it's the narrative that's being defended by political party leaders, and that is what is more troublesome. Anyway,
Indeed.
All right. Keep going.
Okay. So again, like Maduro stripped Congress of his powers basically, and this was so extreme that this is when we start talking about, we were talking about Maduro as a dictator, but now there's a new word for it, which is called the interruption of the constitutional order, which is a fancy way to say that this kind of a self-inflicted coup, in the sense that it's even now more clear that Maduro is basically, he already held the presidency. He is, even if you recognize that he won an election, now he's taking over power by force, and this led to, of course, international condemnation, but also internal condemnation, and even a few people from the Maduro party at this moment, they break relationship with the party and say, this is too much. This is clearly going into a dictatorship. I'm not going to be a part of this. So basically, they jump ship, and also we see like popular condemnation in Venezuela, again mass protests, which are again repressed with an iron fist. And again, and this is sad to talk about in such a matter of fact way, but again we see tens of people killed by the Maduro regime in the context of the protest. But also something that's very important here is that in order to try to sidestep this, Maduro creates a parallel Congress, which he calls a Constituent Assembly, because this is an assembly that their purpose is to draft a new constitution. And something that's very important to Maduro is that he says that this assembly will be supra-constitutional. It means it has powers, even more power, on top of the constitution. So if the Constituent Assembly says something, and even if it contradicts the constitution, this Constituent Assembly should prevail. Should prevail.
Yeah, that's very handy. Don't even try to change the constitution. Just say those people, they decide and they're okay. Yeah, that's useful.
Yes, Maduro. That was his mindset. But in this case, Maduro decided. I said before that he had his hand on the scale, or his finger on the scale, but this time he decided to completely do away with the scale, and these elections were a complete sham. They were a sham to the point that the company that makes the software for the voting machines, after the results for the Constituent Assembly election were announced, they held a press conference saying that they could not vouch for the veracity of the results, which, has a fancy way to say, Maduro is just making numbers up. So this is important because elections, again, until maybe 2016, they were unfair, but you could say that they were kind of representative of at least some part of the will of the people. But from this point on, Maduro, every time Maduro holds an election, he's just making up numbers.
Right.
And something also important that happens in 2017 is that some international sanctions begin to be imposed on the regime, but it's important to be specific because at the beginning these sanctions are on specific members of the regime. I mean, like the vice president, Maduro ministers, etc., etc. They begin to be slapped with personal international sanctions, which say, they cannot, for example, travel to the U.S. or they cannot, buy or sell assets internationally. And the reason this starts to happen is because these people start to be widely seen as responsible for human rights violations on one hand, but also on the other hand to try to put pressure on them to negotiate and say, you have to recognize Congress, you have to go back to being a democracy. So these personal sanctions are a way to try to put pressure on them. And the reason this is important is because from this point on, since the very first sanction, Maduro starts, engaging in information warfare and saying that the crisis in Venezuela, the humanitarian crisis, the lack of food, the lack of medicine, is because of sanctions imposed on the country. And of course, again, if you verify it, this makes no sense because, again, like the humanitarian crisis in the country began earlier, like a few years earlier. And these, sanctions, they don't travel through time, they're not gravity, they could not have a retroactive effect. And number two, there were personal sanctions. So there are not sanctions on the Venezuelan economy, there are not sanctions on oil. So there's no plausible way that they could have affected the Venezuelan economy. So even now, Maduro keeps saying, it's all because of U.S. sanctions and the U.S. blockade. And, this has absolutely no basis on truth.
All right. So where are we now? We're in humanitarian crisis. I guess hyperinflation is here. Yes. International sanctions. That's when we discussed things last time, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes, that's where we were. Just when we did our last episode, and it's like you mentioned, and again, like this is the year, like right after this protest in 2017, which many people look on with hope and thought, okay, this time maybe we will be rid of Maduro, but when that failed, and basically the government managed to quash the protest, and many people respond by fleeing the country, myself included, and that was a start of like really not just the humanitarian but the refugee crisis with millions of people living in Venezuela.
And I also want to specify for people who might not know, they hear inflation or hyperinflation and they're like, well, that like inflation happens everywhere. It's normal. And it's even, when you don't have inflation, it might be a bad thing in some cases. And obviously, the situation in Venezuela and hyperinflation in general essentially means that money has no value.
Yes.
And you have to constantly try and inflate the value of the money or change the value of the money for people to, because you can imagine a country where there is essentially no money, things break down. And the breaking down of the society is what was happening in 2017 when we spoke. I exaggerate maybe a little bit saying there's no money, but we're not so far from that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty close. And to put it in terms, I think healthy inflation in the country is considered to be 1% to 2% inflation annually, or maybe not too far from that figure. In Venezuela last year, we had 1,000,000% inflation. And this is just like a mind-blowing number. I don't think, like, even if I say the numbers, it's not easy to grasp the scale.
Right.
But basically what this means is that prices are rising by maybe 10% every day, which means, if you have money on the bank, a few days later, that money is only worth half its value, and like a couple of weeks later, it's a half its value, and a month later, it's basically worthless. So basically, people cannot save at all if you have any money at all, you had to spend it basically immediately because it loses value by the minute. And again, like wages cannot really keep up with the rise in prices. So basically, what hyperinflation does is, cut down like 95% of the population to poverty, and also to give dimension to the crisis. What people can buy with a minimum wage salary in Venezuela, and again, like maybe 80% of the people earn minimum wage or pretty close to minimum wage salary because like companies cannot really afford to to pay anymore than that. This only buys around 700 calories a day of food. So even if you spend all your money on food, even if you don't have to pay rent, even if you don't buy any clothes, even if all your income goes to food, you can only buy maybe half or less than half of the calories that you need to eat. So as a result, for example, in 2018, most Venezuelans lost about 10 kilos of weight. So what we're seeing is basically famine. I don't know if we cross the line of what mass starvation, what we could call mass starvation, because I think it has a very precise definition for the UN. But the fact is that just like malnourishment is now rampant across Venezuela, and this is bad for grandmas, but this is especially terrible for children.
Of course,
especially children that are malnourished in the first years of their life. They develop permanent deficits. These are kids. We call them the children of Maduro. These are children that even if the situation in Venezuela changed, they suffered malnourishment during their early years, so they're going to grow with physical deficits or even mental deficits. So really, it's just a horrible humanitarian crisis.
So I guess now people who didn't realize, maybe they understand more why we're talking about humanitarian crisis and mass immigration and all of that. Okay, so we finally caught up. I guess people don't need to listen to the old episode after all. We're finally caught up. What's happened since? For me, I'm not even going to try and tell you what I know because it would take like half a second and you would laugh. But what's happened since? Can you tell us?
Okay, well, on 2018, basically two main things happened. I mean, on basically it was like a bad situation getting worse, and the two milestones were that there was this international process to try to have the Maduro regime negotiate with the democratic forces, like giving basically a last attempt at a peaceful resolution to the crisis. But Maduro did what he has done in basically every negotiation attempt or every dialogue attempt. Every time there's pressure on the regime, like in 2014 or in 2017, he calls for dialogue. He says, okay, so this opposition, they're backed by the U.S., they are violent, they won't even, try to talk. So he calls for dialogue, and the democratic forces, say, okay, let's go and talk. But he always approaches negotiations in bad faith. He doesn't really go to the table with the intent, to basically give anything away, because he's a totalitarian almost by definition. He cannot really share power because his political structure will come tumbling down like a house of cards. He cannot really live with checks and balances. So basically, he brings nothing to the table. He just uses negotiation as a stalling tactic to buy time. And it has come to light recently, things like in the 2016 there was a negotiation in which the Vatican tried to intervene, and very recently Pope Francis leaked a personal letter saying to Maduro, because Maduro is calling for negotiations again right now and asking the Vatican to intervene. And the Pope wrote a personal letter saying, we had negotiations in 2016, and basically you fulfill nothing of what you agreed to. So the implied thing is, how can you expect me to negotiate with you or be a mediator when basically you already proved you're not trustworthy? And again, we have like a very important negotiation or attempted negotiation at 2018. But basically, what the Maduro regime did was try to blackmail democratic forces and try to kidnap the family of opposition or democratic politicians and say, okay, you need to agree to my conditions or I will harm your family. But thankfully, negotiations failed. Basically, Maduro tried to force the opposition or the democratic forces to accept his conditions, which basically say, I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here, but it's not far from the truth. Maduro is the eternal emperor of Venezuela forever. And, basically they didn't go along with that. But then what happened is that Maduro then held a new presidential election because his term is due or was due to end at the beginning of 2019, so just a month ago. So there was a need for new presidential elections to be held. So Maduro held them, but they were a complete sham. And just to make sure, basically he barred all democratic force politicians from even running. At this moment, like most politicians are not in Maduro party. Most of them are in exile, or most of them are in jail, or most of them are like barred from holding office or for running on bogus charges. So this was an election that was a complete sham.
When was that? When was the election held? When was the campaign and then the actual voting?
This was in May, which is also unusual because presidential elections are usually held, in November or December, for like a few months before the end of the presidential term. But these were actually held in May, and there's really no justification for doing that. But the reason Maduro did it is that the situation of the country is just getting worse by the month. So, he thought like, okay, maybe I'll still have a little bit of popularity and it will be easier to get at least some votes in May as compared to in December.
Right. Okay. So that was in May last year. And what happened during the election?
Okay, well, basically what happened before the election, basically most democratic countries of the world, including most Latin American countries and most European countries, say, you cannot hold elections in these conditions. These are not free and fair elections. You have no electoral observation at all, no international observation at all. So these elections are just a sham. And they say to Maduro, even before he holds the election, he goes and holds the elections anyway. And of course, no one recognized the results of these elections. Everyone says this is a sham. This is not a valid election. So from that point on, because Maduro held the sham election and he controls the Supreme Court in an illegal manner, basically there is the beginning of an international consensus around Congress. And basically saying, okay, so Congress is the only remaining institution in Venezuela that was democratically elected and thus legitimate.
Okay.
And this is important for what happens next, which is, what happens at the beginning of this year, which is when, everything begins developing very quickly.
So, yeah. Okay, I'll just let you keep going because I'm not going to contribute anything clever. So
okay, so what happens in 2019, which is especially like January the 10th.
Wait, sorry. When was the parliamentary part of it again?
Sorry, the Congress or Parliament?
Yes, the Congress. Yeah.
Yes, it's in Venezuela it's called a National Assembly, but I'm just going to call it Congress to make it easier for everyone to follow, or Parliament. So basically, in January 10th, Maduro's term ends. His previous term ends, and basically, international community says there was no valid election. So now the office of the president in Venezuela is vacant. And what happens then is that Congress says, indeed, the office of the president is vacant because there was no valid election. There is a person who is usurping power, who holds the office of the president de facto by force, but he is not the legitimate president.
Okay.
And there's
So
an article of the. Sorry, yes?
yeah, go ahead. So I see where this is going, but keep going. I'll address it afterwards.
Okay, so there's an article in the Venezuelan Constitution, Article 233, that says that in the event that the president-elect is not able to access office or to be sworn into the office of the president, in this case, the Speaker of the Congress should become the caretaker president and call for elections within 30 days. So the Constitution doesn't specifically say what happens if the current president steals the election or holds a sham election. But most people interpret this article to mean to say that if there's no valid president at the time, then the Speaker of Congress is empowered to assume the mantle or be sworn in as president, just as a stopgap measure for a limited time until new elections can be held. So this
And
is
that's
precisely
where, yeah,
yes, and this is where Juan Guaido comes in. So Juan Guaido, he was elected a congressperson in 2015. He was part of this election, but the role of Speaker of Congress in Venezuela changed every year. Internally, every year they name a new congressperson to be the speaker. And at the beginning of the year, he was named speaker. Up to this point, he was not very well known inside of Venezuela. He was more of the kind of person who works, behind the scenes. And part of the reason he was elected speaker is that most of the other senior congressmen are now again in exile or in prison. So basically,
he's the only one who's left.
Yeah, there is no one who's left. So this more junior congressperson assumes the role of speaker and then becomes president. Basically, there's a ceremony on the January 23rd, which is also an important date for Venezuela, because when we had the dictatorship around 50 years ago, it was on January 23rd that we were free of this dictatorship, that the dictator fled the country. So the speaker chose this date to basically convene the people and have the National Assembly naming and swearing in as the caretaker president of Venezuela, and to the legitimate president of Venezuela instead of Maduro.
So I guess there are two. There's one point and one question I have. The main point of contention for the legitimacy of the Maduro presidency is whether or not the elections were valid, the ones from May 2018 at this point.
Yes.
The pro-Maduro people say, we had an election, what are you talking about? We have a president, F off. And the anti-Maduro people are saying the elections aren't valid, so we need to invoke that article something 3.3. And the person actually pretending to be president shouldn't be. I'm curious, though, Congress still has the power to enact that article and decide that Juan Guaido is to be made president. I can't remember how you called it, but basically making sure that the transition can happen. The Congress still exists enough that it can decide something like that?
I mean, the situation right now is that you mentioned. We have like a de facto government and de jure or legitimate government. And indeed, I mean, Congress still exists in the sense that at least some members, again, are in exile or in prison, but at least most of the members are still free. They are, they're still have access to the building where Congress usually holds office or holds sessions. So basically, I mean, in a
You know,
sense,
it's crazy that we're essentially talking about these kinds of things. Like, do they have physical access to the chambers of Congress? It's kind of, I don't know. We're so comfortable in our democracies in the Western world that talking about these kinds of things seem like the plot of some historical novel or film. You know, it seems outside of our reality. But sorry, it's just one thought that crossed my mind. So okay, they still
no,
have
no,
access to it and they can hold Congress.
okay, so that they can hold Congress, but this is basically like anything that Congress Maduro does. Sorry, anything that the Congress does, basically Maduro ignores it. And since Maduro has control of the armed forces, has control of the national police, basically they do whatever they want. And Congress, they have no weapons, they have no military. So basically, yeah, they can issue rulings, issue decrees, but this is basically has no real power inside of Venezuela, because by now Venezuela is a dictatorship, and basically what there's no rule of law, there is rule of military power. But
I'm
what's
curious.
important, yes,
Oh, go ahead, go ahead. I'll ask after.
but what's really made the difference here is that Congress is the one that's recognized internationally. So
Right.
basically, Congress has no power inside Venezuela, but is starting to gain power outside Venezuela, while it's the opposite
Mm.
inside of Venezuelan territory. Go ahead.
So, why do you think he didn't essentially dismiss Congress? Why did he not, I don't know, destroy the building or declare that Congress didn't need to exist? Was that one step too far for his own illusion of democracy, or
Yes,
what
I
is the?
think so too. I mean, you basically said, how is it possible that like people outside Venezuela, some people still defend this government, and I think part of the reason is that Maduro has been very careful to do things one step at a time, and sometimes he misses steps. But for example, there's a precedent in Venezuela when. I think I may be mistaken here, but I think it was Fujimori in Peru in the 80s or 90s. He was
Mm,
a dictator, but he wanted to maintain the facade of democracy. But at some point, he just like dismissed Congress, but in a very blatant manner. Like I don't know if he destroyed the building, but he imprisoned most of Congress. He
mm,
was very clear about dismissing Congress, and
mhm,
this was a tipping point, and you could say that this was the beginning of his downfall. So of course Maduro has this in mind, and
mm,
and he doesn't want to push his hand too far too fast. So like openly dismissing Congress, openly imprisoning most of Congress instead of like one or two people. At the time, he thought that it may trigger an international backslash. So his policy has been, okay, like I'll take it one step at a time. I will erode democracy one step at a time, very slowly.
mm,
So there's no one event that causes a stronger international reaction.
mhm. Okay, I guess that makes sense. If he was if he did actually quote unquote destroy Congress, it would be
Mm.
even more difficult for his international supporters to support him because he still has some. All right, so we're in this situation where essentially the country has two presidents now, and I'm guessing Juan Guaido became interim president at the beginning of the year, but we knew that was going to happen for months. How were things evolving from maybe a few weeks after the election that was a sham to the end of the year, knowing that this was going to happen? How is the country now? How are things in the country now?
Okay, well, to answer the first question, I mean, you said we knew this was going to happen, but to be honest, there was no certainty at all.
Oh, okay.
Basically, what most of us thought was going to happen is, yeah, like Maduro held a sham election, but he's a dictator. He rules by force. No one is going to care. He's just going to continue steamrolling Congress, and there was, there was no certainty at all whether, Congress was going to invoke this or not. Uh, because it's a dangerous play. In particular, it's a very dangerous play for everyone who decides to assume the mantle of caretaker president. And indeed, right before he was sworn in as president, Guaido was kidnapped by the Maduro forces for a couple of hours.
Oh, really?
We don't know why they released him. Yeah, they arrested him like in bogus charges, or they well at this point of time, the Maduro forces don't even care about bogus charges. They just like kidnap or arrest people, and if necessary, they come up with some charges later. But what was, in a sense, unusual is that when the Maduro regime kidnapped Guaido, this was a terrible thing. But for most Venezuelans, this is business as usual. Like
Right.
the dictatorship doing their thing, just like they do in Cuba. So what was unusual is that they actually released him.
But
So
why,
so
though?
something, huh?
Why?
We can only speculate,
Mm.
and probably part of the reason is that, as I mentioned before, since last year, most democratic countries, recognize the Congress as the only legitimate institution in the country. So probably what happened at the time is that some people in the Maduro regime were a little bit overeager, or they thought they could score points within the regime by kidnapping Guaido. But some other forces within the regime realized, okay, if we do this, the international reaction is going to be too strong. This is going to create a backlash. So this is, like going too far too fast, and decided
Right.
to release him.
Okay.
And this brought up something that's very important, but also I think has brought a lot of misunderstandings in the international community, which is like international recognition. Because as soon as, well, not as soon as, but so Guaido becomes caretaker president, and he is immediately, well, not immediately, sorry again, but he is recognized by over 50 nations in the world as the legitimate president of Venezuela.
Hmm.
So this includes most of Latin America, this includes most of Europe, but also includes, a little bit controversially, the United States.
Right. This and Trump was one of the first presidents to recognize Guaido, which actually might have helped push other countries in that direction. But yeah, that I think most people do know.
Okay, well, in a sense, yes, but I think it's a little bit more subtle than that, in the sense that there was this period between the 10th of January and the 23rd of January, in which it was not clear whether Guaido was caretaker president or not, because Maduro's term ended, and the constitution says that the speaker becomes president, but he has not actually been sworn in. But during this period of time, many Latin American countries, and also the Organization of American States, the OAS, there are several entities that were already giving their support to Guaido, or even saying we recognize him as the new legitimate authority of
Mm,
Venezuela. So my point is that yes, U.S. recognition was of course important, but it's not like the U.S. recognized first and then everyone else fell in
I
line.
see.
There
Mm,
was already strong recognition from many important countries even before the U.S. did.
okay. Okay, so we're going to come back to what's happening now, but I do want to ask, an update on what we were talking about earlier, the hyperinflation, the military power in the country. When we did the last episode, it was kind of chaos, and we didn't know what was actually going to happen to the country. Has inflation stabilized? Like, it can go on for years, hyperinflation. What is the situation for people actually living there now? What is the day-to-day situation, to the best of your knowledge?
Okay. Well, I still have family and friends of Venezuela, so I'm pretty clear on the situation, and
Mm,
it's hard to talk about it in terms of getting across, but it's usually a bad situation getting worse and worse, uh, and people having less and less to go on like every day, and in a sense, like since Venezuela was a country that suddenly collapsed, people have had savings of some sort, maybe not savings in money, but savings in they had a car, they had clothes, or they had family heirlooms. So what has happened in the past few, like few years is that people are holding on the face of this like sudden, outbreak of poverty or sudden poverty by basically like like selling clothes to pay for medicine, or selling their car, or selling their apartment and moving to a room, etc., etc. So people are basically desperately using all their resources to stay alive, to eat. But this is quickly running out. I mean, like people are basically at the end of the rope. Uh,
Is there
and
is there food entering the country? Like, is there medicine coming in? How does the country pay for it? Is it aid? Is there humanitarian aid? How is, because you say, they sell their car to buy food. Who do they sell the car to? What food is there? Agricultural industry in the country, I guess, which can create a little bit of food. What's the picture you're painting is so apocalyptic. I'm kind of picturing a little bit of almost I'm exaggerating, of course, but kind of a Mad Max world. Like you have to hunt what you want to eat.
Okay, we're not quite there yet, but
Okay.
it is. I mean, a little bit post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic, in a sense. I mean, in Venezuela, you go to a street and you will always see crowds of people roaming around looking for trash, so they can roam in the trash and find something to eat in the trash. This is very very disturbing to see, but it happens a lot. You see, like people dying in hospitals from easily treatable diseases, like people dying because there's no antibiotics or there's no medicine for tension. So people, yes, are dying from easily treatable diseases. And again, what's happened is that like people are holding on by going without, like eating only 1 or 2 meals a day. And basically also what's sustaining the economy is what we now call the Venezuelan diaspora, which is what I mentioned, like we had mass migration over the past few years. And since Venezuelan currency is so worthless now, people who have gone to other countries, if they can find a decent job, they send money back to Venezuela. And this is also how lots of people who are still in Venezuela survive. But basically, when it comes to production, yeah, like there's still some production left in Venezuela, but not nearly enough to feed the country. And also the Maduro government, I mean, basically trading oil money for food, sells oil and uses it to buy food, but a part of a corruption scheme. And he has created something that's called CLAP boxes, CLAP, which are boxes of food that he distributes to people. And for a lot of people, this is the only source of food they have.
I see.
And this food is usually it's not enough. It's usually contaminated. It's usually like rejects from other countries. But Maduro is giving this as a way, basically as a means of social control, and basically pressures people into saying, I'm going to hold a demonstration, so you should come up in support of Maduro, or we will take your food box away.
Okay, and that's been the situation, slowly getting there from when we last spoke in 2017.
Yes, and also something that's important is you mentioned humanitarian aid, and most international bodies recognize that there's a humanitarian crisis in the country, and they have offered to send humanitarian aid, but basically Maduro has refused to receive any humanitarian aid, and basically he denies that there's a humanitarian crisis in the country. He claims that this is all a lie created by right-wing media.
Mm. What's happening with the inflation? Has the value of the money stabilized, or is it still in a free fall?
No. It's still in free fall. I mean, we had 1,000,000% inflation last year, and I think we're going to have. I mean, if nothing changed, probably 10,000,000% inflation this year. And what happened is basically what you say. There's no money in the country anymore, so people are either resorting to trade. For example, I have 2 packs of spaghetti, so I will trade you one by a pack of beans, this kind of thing. Or also the economy has become de facto dollarized. And
De facto
like
what?
for
Sorry.
dollarized, using
Right,
the
right. So
US
they use
dollar as
foreign currency
currency,
and dollars. Yeah, yeah.
using foreign currency. And as for a few years now, like any important operation, like for example selling your car, or yeah, like selling your car, no one will do it in bolivars. That will be crazy because you say a
Of
price,
course, yeah.
and then 2 days later you have to use like a different price, and is also like Venezuelan money, as I mentioned, you get it, you have to spend it right away. But this makes no sense if you're going to get a large quantity like a car. So for a while now, sales of cars, sales of apartments had been, done in US dollars. Of course, this is all off the books because the Venezuelan government won't recognize, anything that's transacted in US dollars. So this was a
So
situation
so
a
wait,
few years
how
ago.
does it
Yes.
how does it work then? Do people actually have dollar bills, physical dollar bills, or do they have like different bank accounts in different currencies? Do you know how that works, or are you not sure?
Okay, no, yes. Basically, yes. Some people do have like effect, yeah, like cash, like US cash,
Okay.
and used for that. But other people they have international bank accounts, and probably if you live like in a normal country, you probably only have a bank account in the country you live in. But for most Venezuelans, it has become a necessity to have a US a bank account that's denominated in US dollars. So I'm not going to say everyone, but like a lot of people, especially if you want to buy a car or you want to sell an apartment, then
Mm,
you need to have a US bank account, and that means
okay.
a bank account that's outside of the country.
So the Venezuelan currency, the bolivars,
Yes,
is being abandoned
yes,
for
it's
most
basically
transactions.
being abandoned, and as I mentioned, this was a situation a couple of years ago, but now, like let's say late 2018, even for smaller transactions, like buying groceries, then people are using dollars. They
Right.
have like $1 bill or cents, and they use that as currency.
Hmm.
So as we call this like de facto dollarization of the economy. I mean, the government or the Maduro regime still tries to to make people use the bolivar, but in fact it's now worthless, and now people are using the dollar informally as means of trade, as means
Hmm.
of holding value.
Okay. All right. So I guess the final part of the discussion is what is happening now. What's been happening since Guaido was named president and he was recognized. And where do you think it's going to go? I don't know if we can speculate, but yeah, are people hopeful? Is the situation devolving further into chaos? How is Maduro reacting beyond what we see in outside media? What do you think?
Okay, so yes, I think so. People are hopeful. I mean, it is. I think for after a long time of like maybe 1 or 2 years where people were basically hopeless, people are hopeful that this may be the one time that we get rid of Maduro. For most people, we believe this may be our last opportunity. It's now or never. Also, when talking about humanitarian aid, there are about 300,000 Venezuelans that had been identified as in danger of dying pretty soon. if they don't get access to humanitarian aid because either because of diseases or because of extreme malnourishment. So for most people, it's like now or never. On the other hand, Guaido is very realistic. He says, I'm the de jure president, I'm the caretaker president, but we are in a dictatorship. The Maduro controls the military. So the roadmap for Guaido, he has a roadmap with 3 points, which are one, end of usurpation. Basically, this means Maduro has to go away. Two, have a transitional government that can bring some measure of order to the country. And number three, of course, have fair and free elections because Guaido is only a caretaker president. He wants to hold elections as soon as possible. And basically, internally, what's going to be the deciding factor is the military. Maduro has the support of the military and has the support of the top generals in the country, basically because the military has been corrupted almost completely. It's been 20 years since Chavez came to power, so he has he has had time to basically turn the military into his personal yeah
Well,
personal
force,
militia.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, personal force. And this also with regards to Maduro, but also a way that Maduro keeps the military in line is by using money. uh, so if Maduro runs out of resources to pay the military, we don't know what will happen. But also, like, the generals are being paid off handsomely. But as you go to the middle ranks or the lower ranks, the military is suffering through the same things that the rest of the country is
Hmm.
suffering. So basically, what Guaido he's trying to do many things at once, but one that's crucial is trying to make a plea for the military to switch sides. Basically, the only thing that holds Maduro in power is the military by force. So if the military defects, or even if the military declares themselves neutral and they say, okay, we're not going to, for example, kill people anymore or repress mass demonstrations anymore, then Maduro will have no option than to
Hmm.
flee. So, but so far, we don't know what's going to happen with that. I mean, at the top, of course, generals keep saying, we recognize Maduro, we're strong with Maduro. And there's been some defections on the military, but not mass defections just yet. So we don't know what's going to happen with that. But on the international front, interesting things are happening. And as a result of all these countries recognizing Guaido, basically Guaido has begun a process of taking control of Venezuelan assets. And of course, this makes sense. If, for example, Europe says, okay, the legitimate government is Guaido, then it makes no sense that if you buy Venezuelan oil, then you go and pay Maduro, because you are
Hmm.
saying the legitimate owner of this, or the legitimate caretaker, or the legitimate administrator of Venezuelan oil is Guaido. So if we are buying Venezuelan oil, then it should, the proceeds should go to the Guaido administration.
Right. So to an
So
account
what's
that
happening?
Guaido has, again, it's kind of like, do you have physical access to Congress? It's like
Yes.
who has the login code to the account that holds the money that the people buying the oil are sending the money to. And if,
Exactly.
yeah, and so if Guaido or, his aides or whatever has the right password, then they can use the money to redistribute or fund their initiatives and whatever. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, it really comes down to that, I suppose.
Yeah, it really comes down to like facts on the ground.
Mm,
uh, so yeah, again, like, what's happening right now is that in Venezuela, Maduro still controls the oil industry, has physical control of the institutions, but basically he's having trouble selling that oil to everyone. I mean, he has a few allies left that haven't recognized Guaido, that recognize Maduro,
mm,
namely Russia, China, Cuba, North Korea, Turkey. Uh, So basically, he's now trying to redirect oil sales to them, but it's not easy.
Mm.
And also, there have already been instances where, for example, the Venezuelan state held, for example, gold reserves or foreign accounts overseas. And there have been cases where Maduro is trying to, for example, repatriate this money or make use of this money, and international institutions are saying no, no, we don't recognize you as the owner of these accounts anymore.
Mm.
So you are not allowed to move them. In some cases, they're giving control to Guaido. In other cases, they're being, they're taking a middle ground and say we're not going so far as to give control to someone else, but we're not giving control to Maduro either. So they're frozen until we see what happens.
Mm. And I guess in these situations, either it can put enough pressure on the person that is quote unquote the usurper or the dictator, because
Yes.
they don't have enough money to pay off the generals that still support him, or it can lead to a continued, I guess it can't really get much worse, but the continued crisis, because there isn't even the money to pay for those food boxes anymore. And I'm sure he can say, because of the international pressure to institute this false president, I don't have money to send you food, and that's why you're starving even more. So, yeah, what do you think is going to happen?
Okay, so well, of course, it's very hard to say what's going to happen. Basically, it's a standoff situation right now. So it's whether it's whether can the Maduro government hold power, and there's a big parallel. I think I mentioned this on the previous podcast, but basically, like Cuba is a big advisor to the Maduro regime, or even if you go further, Cuba is really the regime in control of Venezuela. You could say that Maduro is basically a puppet regime to Cuba. This sounds like a harsh thing to say, but ask any Venezuelan, and most of them, if you ask them, does Cuba call the shots in Venezuela? They say yes. They are really calling the shots. And basically, the advice of Cuba to Venezuela is say, hold on. You have the force, you have the military. In Cuba, we had a time after the Soviet Union collapsed where we have no money and we managed to hold into power by force. So try to do that. And Maduro has things that he's trying to do. And as I mentioned, like he is starting to run out of money, but also this may start to create problems not only for him but for most of Venezuelan population. So I think he's going to try to play that off. And also public opinion is like international public opinion is something that he's going to try to manipulate. And in a sense, I don't want to say that it's working, but he is already trying to do that. And one of the ways that Maduro is reacting is, like I mentioned, like
so wait, what is he?
warfare.
What is he? How is he trying to spin it? Is he trying to say that the Guaido is? I mean, he is trying to say that Guaido is not the legitimate president or holder of the power, but it's just that, right? That's what he's trying to say.
Well, he's also trying to spin it as saying that this is an U.S.-backed coup. I mean, that basically Guaido is a U.S. operative, and that what's happening in Venezuela is the U.S. government trying to remove a legitimate government and trying to install a right-wing government, or a government that is, loyal to U.S. interests. So they will give Venezuelan oil to the U.S. And in light of everything that we just said, this may sound ridiculous, but lots of important people are buying it. Much to my disappointment. I have even seen, U.S. senators buy the Maduro regime line, and say like the U.S. should not anoint a new leader in a troubled country, which is not what happened. So to recap, basically Maduro wants to play this as like something as U.S. intervention versus a legitimate government, or U.S. intervention versus the people, or left wing versus right wing. And of course, I mentioned the U.S. among another 50 countries supported Guaido, which means Trump supports Guaido. And not a lot of people know about Venezuelan politics, but a lot of people know about U.S. politics, and they hate Trump.
Mm,
So basically, the reasoning says, okay, if Trump does something, it must be bad. And if
mm,
Trump is supporting some guy that I never heard of in Venezuela, this is probably a bad guy.
mm,
So sadly, this line of thinking and this kind of information warfare is I don't want to say it's working, but I think it's working on some people.
mm.
Hopefully, a minority. Hopefully, people will investigate, find reliable sources, and find out. But yes, Maduro is trying to try to paint this in a light that if not favors him, because at this moment it's very hard to be for the Maduro regime, but try to say that there are two forces in conflict, and that we should try to solve this by dialogue and negotiation, and especially not by U.S. intervention, etc., etc.
Hmm. Yeah, if I'm trying to look really hard for the credible part of the criticism of the support of the US, it is not the first time that the US would go into a country and give the oil market to its companies and maybe not care so much about the political situation. I don't think that's what's happening here, but I think there is this history that people can hold on to justify the what's happening now in the vision they have of that support. So I think it's worth mentioning. But yeah, certainly it doesn't seem like that is comparable in that sense.
No, I mean you're absolutely right. I mean, history is there. We cannot deny that this happened. That the U.S. has a story of interventionism in Latin America, especially in the second half of the 20th century. But indeed, it's important to not look at what's happening now in Venezuela through the lens of that. And again, like sometimes it's a little bit disappointing to see like over 50 countries supporting Guaido, but people only look at the U.S.
Hmm.
Or even, something that's a bit controversial is that the United States has says that all options are on the table when it comes to supporting Guaido. And not only Trump said this, also the Colombian government and the Brazilian government, which are, the governments that had frontiers with Venezuela, they have
Hmm.
also said this, but of course people only pay attention to what Trump says. And this is a very controversial statement. I understand why. No one would like to see, military intervention in Venezuela. No one would like to see U.S. troops or any kind of international troops in Venezuela. But it's also important that this option is on the table. I think maybe the only reason that Maduro hasn't gone in and kidnapped or killed Guaido or members of Guaido's fledgling government is the fear, maybe not on the part of Maduro, but in the part of the soldiers that will actually have to go and execute those orders, will be to say, okay, if we go and kill Guaido, then the U.S. will send military forces, because that's the only thing that they're afraid of. The only thing that they're afraid of is, actual military forces, foreign military forces, because there are people who their only language, the only language they understand is the language of force.
Hmm.
So the threat of military action, I think, is very important for peaceful resolution. I think if military action is completely off the table, then Maduro will be sitting there comfortably, confident that he can weather this.
Mm.
There will be less reasons for the military to defect soon, because also we want them to defect soon, because the situation is getting worse, by the way. So this may be ironical, but I think like the threat of military action is an important factor for this to have a peaceful resolution by uh, by having the military defect.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if this is completely off the table, as some people want it to be, then I think counterintuitively, the chance for a civil war in Venezuela and having, for example, the military split in two parts
Yeah.
and go to war to
Okay.
each other, I think this actually increases. So I know this is like a controversial part of what's happening, but it's the facts, and I think it's important to, like you mentioned, take a look at the whole picture. So this is not about a U.S. backed coup. This is not about left wing versus right wing. This is not about U.S. sanctions crippling the economy, and this is not about U.S. intervention. This is about a dictatorial regime and democratic forces that are trying to make Venezuela go free, and that they are supported by an international coalition. Hopefully, it won't come to international, like to any kind of military intervention.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I hope when we speak again in a year or two, that the situation will have been resolved in a peaceful manner. But I it seems so difficult to get there. I don't know. I mean, when you look at the situation, you think, yes, if the money runs out and this and that, it should kind of collapse. The Maduro regime should collapse. But we have so many examples of regimes that managed to hold on, and especially since we have some countries that have interests in supporting these kinds of strongmen. They can kind of function in this closed ecosystem, and I don't know. All right, I think we're kind of caught up. You've explained a lot, and I think you've made things a lot more clear. Is there anything you want to add before we conclude the show and hopefully head towards, as I was saying, a peaceful resolution in the next few months?
Okay, well, yes, it's well, two things. You say a few months, but it just like in 10 days, there's going to be a critical date. This is the February 23rd, because right now there's also an standoff regarding humanitarian aid.
Mm.
Because basically the Maduro regime refuses any kind of humanitarian aid at all. But the Guaido government says we need humanitarian aid urgently. So we're going to try and get humanitarian aid into the country. And this is also a little bit controversial in the sense that humanitarian aid, usually if the government of that country doesn't want humanitarian aid, well, humanitarian aid is not supposed to cause any kind of conflict. It should be like a very straightforward progress. So what do you do in the case of a country that has two governments and one of the governments want humanitarian aid to enter the country and desperately needs humanitarian aid to go in? Because as I mentioned, there are 300,000 Venezuelans who are, in danger of dying in the next few weeks if humanitarian aid doesn't enter the country. So what's happening right now is that I don't want to say must, because I don't have a picture of the full scope of humanitarian organizations in the world, but some very important humanitarian organizations and also some countries are hearing Guaido's call for help. And right now, on the borders of Venezuela, especially in Colombia and in Brazil, where there are some humanitarian aid stations being set up, and basically humanitarian aid is being sent there. But the big question is, how do we get this into Venezuela? And basically, Guaido right now is organizing people and saying we are going to get this humanitarian aid in Venezuela, and he's making basically, you could say it's a plea, or you could say it's an order, because he's the legitimate, head of state, an order to military forces to say, let this humanitarian aid go in. Not only because I want to do it, but because this is humanitarian aid that people desperately need. Even your own family could be
Hmm.
in need of this aid. So please let the humanitarian aid in. Basically, he's saying, do not obey Maduro's orders to 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 stop the humanitarian aid to go in. Let it go in.
Right, right,
So
right.
we don't
It's a
know what's going to
mm.
happen. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All
So I
right. You
mean, in a
said there
sense, you
were.
could say it's a way to get humanitarian aid in Venezuela, but it's
It's
also
also a power play. He's trying to establish himself as the leader of the armed forces, or at least it's so hard to see how this doesn't. There are so many ways that this can devolve into armed conflict. It's very frightening.
yeah,
But
it's like you say, it's also a way to at least undermine the authority of Maduro to say, okay, if there are orders by Maduro that are too harsh or too against the interests of the people, at some point the military will not respond.
mm,
Uh, so yes, and indeed, this is also a little bit controversial. I mean, you could make the case that this humanitarian aid is desperately needed. We should make every effort to get in. You could also make the case that having humanitarian aid as part of something that could be regarded as a power play is right, is it wrong, and I can see both sides. But of course, I'm a Venezuelan, and I'm desperate for there being a change in
mm.
regime. I'm desperate for this humanitarian aid to go in. So I completely agree with everything that Guaido has done so far.
Mhm. All right. Well, let's hope things move in the right way. Thank you so much again, Saul, for taking the time to explain all of this to us and to give us the details. Is there any resource you would recommend people check out, or actually your Twitter account maybe might be useful? Where can people find you and find stuff that would be useful to understand all of this?
Yes, I mean, there's my Twitter account. These days, I tweet mostly stuff about Venezuela, of course.
Mm.
So my Twitter account is ESAULGD. I'll give you the link later so you can post it
It will be in the show notes. I have it.
on the website. But there's also this great resource. There's this website called Caracas Chronicles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I mentioned it in the previous episode.
You did.
They are a very reliable source on Venezuelan news. They have daily reports on what's happened in Venezuela. So if you want to follow the news in a day by day basis, they can help you with that. But they also have explainers. They have opinion articles, predictions about what's going to happen. So if anyone wants to follow the Venezuelan crisis as it unfolds in the next few days, and hopefully it will be a few more days or weeks, not too long, not months, then this is a great resource, and it's all in English. It's all completely in English, so it's easy for the non-Spanish speaking audience to follow.
All right. Thank you very much. For me, it's Not Patrick on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And of course, you know that you can find the show at FrenchSpin.com. You can comment there if there are things that you want to add to this conversation. And if you enjoy the show, you can support it at patreon.com/the Phileas Club. This is the only way the show is funded. We don't have sponsors or anything like that. It's entirely funded and free and independent thanks to your support. So thank you so much to those who do support the show. If you choose to do that, the link is in the show notes, and it's very easy to do, very easy and quick. Patreon. I'm not going to talk about this too much. So that's about it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in a few weeks, I hope, with a regular episode. And that I'm a little bit shaken by all of this, but I hope we can do another one in a few months or years and look back on this with fond memories. I don't know. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back soon. And thanks, Saúl, for being on again. Bye.